Well, Exodus chapter 21. A few Wednesdays ago, we finished our study of the Ten Commandments. Exodus chapter 20. We're now in Exodus chapter 21. We get more laws from the Lord, but they are not disconnected from the Ten Commandments that he gave us in Exodus chapter 20. Really, what we have in Exodus chapter 20 is the principles. And then in chapter 21 and moving forward, we have the precepts of those principles. We have the application of those principles. We have those principles put into street language for those people at that time. This was written about 3,500 years ago. So if you have trouble directly relating to their problems or their judgments or their laws or their principles at this time, well, there's a reason for that. A lot has changed in 3,500 years. This is the civil law that we are now moving forward into. We are coming from the Ten Commandments, the law of God. We're now moving into the civil law or the law of Moses, the breakdown of those commandments. And the civil law, if the Lord were to write it up for us today, it would read very differently, because the cultures have changed so much. And I want to just stress the point as we get going that this was written primarily for these Jews at this time. It would serve them well for many generations on into the flip of the calendar and the coming of Jesus Christ. And then with the coming of Jesus Christ, we get full revelation, we get full light, we get full knowledge of the heart of the Lord. And so then these civil laws that we read about beginning in Exodus chapter 21 take on a very different role for a New Testament Christian believer. And we covered that in our introduction, our prelude to our study of the Ten Commandments. I pointed you to Acts chapter 15, and I showed you right there that the early church had a council meeting there in Headquarters Church, Jerusalem, and the topic was, what do we do with these Gentiles that the Lord is saving? We can't deny that for some reason the Lord has chosen to bring those wacky Gentiles into the kingdom and save them. Now we got to figure out what that needs to look like. And so they began to examine that topic and ask that question: does the New Testament Gentile believer, does the New Testament Christian need to live by the civil law of Moses in order to be saved? And right there in verse 29, Acts chapter 15, you see their decision. Their decision was no. A New Testament Gentile Christian does not need to live by the civil law of Moses in order to be saved, except with those few exclusions that are listed there in verse 29. Those were some things that the Lord himself, while on the earth, confirmed to be the heart of God. That is, those civil laws that Moses wrote up concerning fornication, adultery. That includes the whole broad category. Things offered to idols, things strangled, and from blood. The apostles decided there, as the Holy Spirit was leading them, that the Gentile believer needed to observe those things from the Old Testament civil law of Moses. Some of them, I do suspect, just for the purpose of not absolutely further offending potential Jewish future converts. And so there you have that listing of a few exclusions. But that determination changed everything. It really did. And I can't, it always amazes me when I listen to a Christian try to tell another Christian that they need to live by the Old Testament civil law. Listen, that's a really bad idea, because as I shared with you before, as God is giving these laws, and now in Exodus chapter 21, these judgments that are connected to the Ten Commandments, as he's giving these to his people, what he's doing is he's giving a progressive revelation. He's laying some groundwork. He's taking the nation who all they really knew was pagan upbringing and pagan background. He's taking these pagans out of pagan lifestyle, and he's taking them on baby steps. He's giving them progressive revelation. So you're going to see in this chapter and future chapters that the Lord doesn't, well, I don't want to get ahead of myself. The Lord makes certain surprising moves in the law. So much so that if we were to, as New Testament Christians, begin living by the civil law, what we're actually going to be doing is taking major steps backward in our understanding of God's word and our understanding of God's heart. We're taking major steps backwards, especially when we consider the things that Jesus had to say about the civil law. So we don't want to do that. We want to understand this for what it is. It's progressive revelation. It's the Lord getting his people started, bringing them into a solid base, moving them forward, and revealing more to them about the heart of God and the laws of God as they go on in their relationship with him. So, with that said, we know we don't have to keep these laws per se. We don't need to keep them to be saved. We have a few exceptions. We have a few exclusions. But we understand that the book is not a throwaway book. These laws are not throwaways. They're not things to ignore, because what we can do from these passages of principles and judgments is we can learn from them. We can extract from these principles, pull them away from the particulars, learn the principles, and place them in our particulars. Place them in situations and applications that make sense for us and apply to daily life in 2021. So that's what we want to do. We actually learn a lot from the Old Testament law, and I love it. I love to study through this. I learn so much. And you might be stating from the beginning, is it really all that important? Do I really need to learn about slavery? It's not really a thing now. Do I really need to, what does it matter to me what's up with the neighbor's ox? Who cares? I don't care about their oxen. Doesn't make sense to me, doesn't apply to me. Yes, it does. You just have to change the particulars, extract the principles, and put them into your own particulars. Learn those principles and live your life by those principles. So I find them to be very important for Christian life. All in all, when you're studying through the law of the Lord, what you're really doing is learning about the Lord of the law. And I think that's what we all want. You see from these principles the character and nature of God. You're getting revelations about him. Slowly but surely, you're getting those revelations. You're learning about him. Not just the law of the Lord, but the Lord of the law. And I think we all want that. Ultimately, what we'd love is for everyone in the world to be living by not these laws directly, but these laws indirectly, applied properly to modern life. And if everyone was living by these laws, you know what we'd have? I've said it before, we'd have a paradise on earth. We'd have the closest thing to heaven you could have on earth. That is my motivation, my one entire motivation for my ministry, to get as many other people as I can living after the heart of the Lord, because I know when we do that, number one, we are at peace and harmony with God, and if we're at peace and harmony with God, we are at peace and harmony with fellow mankind. So it's a lovely endeavor to set out on, and I know, unfortunately, this is, as wonderful as it is, a section where we tend to lose people. It's a section where people that set out to study through the scriptures, they get to, they start in Genesis. Oh, the stories are cool. Oh, love the stories of Genesis. They move into Exodus. Oh, the story of the deliverance of the nation of Israel, wonderful. We get to the Ten Commandments, okay, still there, but now we get into the minutia of the law, the civil law, and people just go, boy, right over my head, and they lose interest, and a lot of them stop reading. If they do go further, usually we lose them at Leviticus. When you get to Leviticus, people are like, okay, this is too much. It's hurting my brain. But listen, I think if you'll take this study seriously, it will benefit you in your, modern day Christianity, in your modern day walk with the Lord. Let's begin reading. Verse 1. Now these are the judgments which you shall set before them. And make sure you hear this point. The laws that God gave to Moses here, the judgments that he gave to Moses here, were not for the commoner, the civilian, to take matters into their own hands. A civilian there in the Hebrew nation couldn't just look up these laws and say, okay, my neighbor did this to me, here's the punishment, I'm going to go exact that punishment. No, that was not for the commoner, for the civilian to do. What we have in this chapter and the chapters forward of this chapter is legal judgments. This is the court manual, if you will. And if this is the court manual, if these are legal judgments to preside over legal proceedings, who do you suppose would be qualified to enact and exact these judgments? Number one, Moses, of course, but also, who is it that handles issues of judgments in courts? It's judges, right? You remember back from Exodus chapter 18, Moses' father-in-law packs up his bags and, well, you get it, Jethro, his father-in-law Jethro, shows up and gives Moses some counsel, seeing that Moses is just stressed and burdened with all of the work on him. Literally, all Moses had time to do all day was sit down and let case after case after case be brought to him from the civilians, from the population, the community. And one after another, Moses gave those judgments according to his knowledge of the Lord. Jethro said, you can't keep that up. At that pace, you're going to burn out. You need workers. You need helpers. Rulers over hundreds, 50s, 10s. You remember all that? They were called judges. So this is what this book is talking about when in the civil law, the judges are being referred to. For example, verse 6 of this chapter, the judges that are being spoken about are those 70 men that Moses selected to help him judge over the nation. Remember how it was supposed to work? Those 70 judges were to handle the smaller cases, and Moses was supposed to handle the doozies. So I would suspect that it looks something like this. Scuffles over property and possessions, those matters could be filtered off and handled by those 70 judges. Issues of capital punishment, which we'll get to next week, those, I think, were doozies. I think those had to be brought before Moses so that he could have the final say and apply the judgments that the Lord gave him on those issues of capital punishment. So that's who these laws were given specifically to, not to the people for vigilante justice, but for the judges to use these judgments in order to judge between the matters of the nation. Verse 2, here's the first judgment. If you buy a Hebrew servant, he, and yes, this is exclusively in verse 2 speaking about male servants. We're going to get a different set of laws regarding the female servants. So what we're speaking about first is the male servant. If you buy a Hebrew servant, he shall serve 6 years, and in the 7th he shall go out free and pay nothing. And all I can say is let the controversy begin. What a move from the Lord. People who hate the Lord love to point out this law of God that God chose here to give laws surrounding slavery, and they choose to use this to bash him. First of all, I want to make a point that the Lord did not institute slavery. The Lord did not start this thing. This thing was already in motion. Slavery was already taking place all over the globe. For example, the children of Israel just came out of slavery. So this was not God's creation or invention. Slavery already existed, but it is true. God chose not to abolish it at this time. I'm surprised. How about you? I would expect God right from the start to say, that's it, this slavery thing that you guys are used to, this slavery thing that you are no doubt going to fall back into, don't do it, avoid it, stay away from it. So big question right from the start, why from the beginning didn't God just cut this tree down at the roots and say altogether slavery is abolished? Well, let me throw another question at you. The Lord hates divorce. The Lord never intended for divorce. The Lord said from the very beginning From the beginning it was not so. God's original intention, one man, one woman for life. So why did God allow Moses to write in the law of Moses rules about divorce? How about polygamy? We're going to get to that one too in this chapter. How about polygamy? God is against polygamy, and he eventually cuts it off and stops it. Why not from the beginning? From the beginning, you're going to see him give laws regarding polygamy, and it's going to blow your mind. And people from outside of the world that criticize the Lord's word will point to those passages and say, you Christians are fools. Your God's insane. Well, it's like this. Why did God do that with divorce? Why didn't God just say no divorce? It's real simple. It's because regardless of God's perfect standard, regardless of God's perfect ideal, God knows what? People are going to do it anyway. Right. People are going to divorce, myself included. Not my idea, not my desire, but it happened. I thank the Lord it did now. Sorry to say that, but hey, the Lord knew. Though he hates divorce, though that one relationship between the man and the woman for life is his perfect ideal, he knows that human beings are messy, living in a messy world. And so what the Lord did was he put some parameters around divorce. In other words, saying, okay, I don't want you to divorce. That's not my perfect ideal for you. But if you're going to divorce, here's some restraints, here's some restrictions, here's some parameters to make sure that it's done so fairly. Such is the case with polygamy in the scriptures, in the civil law. Such is the case with slavery. It is not that the Lord endorses slavery. It's not that this is what he wants. It's that he knows this was going to take place. This would be a tendency of human beings to exercise authority over others and bring others in servitude and subjection to them. So the Lord says, since I know that's going to happen, I know I'm reading into this, but I'm telling you, I really believe that's what's behind this. I look at it like this, as if the Lord is saying, since slavery is going to happen, what I'm going to do is I'm going to tighten the restrictions around it. I'm going to build a fence. I'm going to place parameters around that institution of slavery so that all parties involved can get a fair shakeout, a fair deal in life, and things can work as smoothly as possible under the institution of slavery. A couple things I want you to know about God-regulated slavery, and that's what this is, not God-instituted, not God-mandated, but God-regulated slavery. I want you to know a couple things. First of all, a Hebrew, a Jew, was not allowed to have a Hebrew or a Jewish slave against their will. Everyone heard that, right? So immediately we need to start looking at Old Testament God-regulated slavery different than we do early American slavery. Different thing altogether. Number one, no Hebrew, no Jew could be held as a slave against their will. They could not, well, I should say this, they could not enter into slavery or be brought into slavery against their will. It had to be their choice. You say, well, why would someone do that? It should be obvious. If a person is poor and are not doing well in the economic system, they don't have a farm, they don't own a business, they have no way to make ends meet, they have no way to buy food and clothing, they need something, they need to make a living. This was a potential opportunity for them. They could choose to be slaves to another Jew, and then this would serve as a 6-month contract, a 6-month period. That Jew serving under another Jew willfully for 6 years, and at the end of that 6-year period, boom, the contract was terminated, the whole thing was done, and that Jew went free. Now, the Lord did allow the Jews to retain slaves of foreigners against their will, But that was because of the situation of prisoners of war. And that was the way that war worked. If a nation would come up against the nation of Israel in a war, and the Israelites would defeat that nation and capture those prisoners, they could make those prisoners slaves against their will. But that only stands to reason, that only makes sense. And I say, if you're going to bring war against the nation of Israel, good for you, you got what you deserve. I'm okay with you being a slave. I agree with the Lord on that. But in general, no one entered into slavery in God's regulated system of slavery against their will. It was people that chose to do so by decision, willfully, intentionally, because they wanted to make the living. I think really people today, when it comes to slavery, it's just that the word has become a bad thing. And so when they read that word in the scriptures, they just immediately are affronted by the whole topic, the whole principles and laws that are set into motion for slavery, because it's just such a bad thing in their mind. But if I'm being honest, I am a firm believer, maybe you've heard me say it before, I'm a firm believer that in 2021, although we may appear sophisticated and we may shun the word slavery or the thought of slavery, the fact is, we in 2021, modern society, we put up with a form of slavery as well. You know we do, don't you? Take the word slavery and change it to the workforce. Take the word master and change it to the word manager. Take the word slave or servant, by the way, same exact word. Take the word slave or servant and change it into the word employee. And there you have it, truly a modern day form of slavery. So I think it's a little bit hypocritical for people outside of the church to look at the laws that God has placed here on slavery and refer to the Lord as being a monster because he allowed this to exist in the early days. We call it work, we call it jobs. Really, it's just slavery with a facelift. It's slavery with different terminology and slightly different roles, slightly different definitions, slightly different assignments. Here's what it all boils down to. It all boils down to this. There are three possible life statuses. Status number one, person status number one is this. You have so much money already that you never have to work another day in your life. And if that's you, if you're in that category, truly, you are the only free person. That person group, that people group is the only truly free people group in the whole country and in the whole world. Two more categories, and both of them are involved in the workforce. Category number two would be, hey, you need money, so you own a business. Maybe you have land that you farm, you own a business, whatever it may be. So you work for yourself. You work for your business, but you're still working. You understand that? You're a slave to your business. That's where your devotions are. That's where your commitments are. You're a slave to that business. You're a slave to that farming. You're a slave to whatever it is that you do for a living in order to bring in money. And then, of course, there's category number three, person group, people group number three. And that is you need money. You don't own a farm. You don't have a business. You don't know how to get there. You don't have the capital that you need to get started because everyone knows it takes money to make money. And you can't do that, so what do? You turn to another guy's business and you say, let me work for you. That was essentially what Old Testament slavery was. It was going to the wealthy and it was saying, okay, you have a farm, I'll work your farm 6 years. I'll work your farm and I'll get benefits from that. I'll get payment from that. I can live from that. There's your three people groups. There's your three categories of people. And I will say, if you did a little running comparison between God-regulated slavery and modern-day slavery, aka the workforce, I think you might be surprised at how many pros would be in the God-regulated slavery of the Old Testament, as opposed to how many are in the category of modern-day slavery, the workforce, working for someone else. For example, Old Testament God-regulated slavery, God demanded that all masters, all managers, all bosses, God demanded that all masters be good and fair. That was part of God's God-regulated Old Testament system of slavery that he suffered, that he allowed, that he permitted. But that may not be the case for you because your boss may not follow such stringent guidelines. Your boss may have no moral compass or no religion or no set of life principles or laws that he lives by in order to restrict him to be a good boss to you. So he may be an all-out jerk. There's a chance that your boss today is more unfair with you than an Old Testament master in slavery was to their slaves. Very good chance of that. So we're going to say pro for the Old Testament column. Why? Because that was a mandate. That was a rule. They had to be fair. Here's the law stating that. Secondly, Old Testament slavery was set up so that slaves got to eat from their master's tables and live in their master's home. And yet, what does your boss do after work? He forces you to go home, live under your own roof that you have to pay for, and eat your own food that you have to pay for. That's another pro, I think, in the Old Testament slavery column. At least you got to live with the master there in his home. You got to eat from the master's table. It wasn't a bad situation if it was regulated as God regulated it. Then you had Old Testament slavery was a 6-year commitment. What about today? You're free to go, right? You can come and go as you please. You can quit a new job every day of your life if you want to, and if you can get them that fast. You're free to go. There's no commitment unless you're with the military, and then, of course, you have a 4-year commitment, so it's closer. But there's an advantage for the modern slave, the modern workday. They had a 6-year commitment to serve out. You don't have a commitment, so you can quit whenever you want, but you're still losing money. So there's an advantage for the modern day slavery column. But you see where I'm getting at. There's pros and cons to each. There's some aspects of Old Testament slavery that wasn't the way we think it was. Now, if you think I'm an advocate for slavery, if you think I'm pro-slavery, if you think I'm suggesting that slavery is not an awful thing, you're wrong. That's not what I'm doing. I'm simply showing you we need to get our thinking in the right place. This isn't early American history slavery where things were unfair, where things were bad. No, this is Old Testament, God-regulated slavery. And if it was done right, it was a good thing. So much so that you're going to see in this very chapter, you're going to see there were people that rather loved it. There were people that preferred it. So, one more thing I want to point on before we move on to verse 3 is that, did you notice, once again, we see that 6-1 ratio from the Lord. 6-1 ratio. This seems to be the ratio that the Lord always uses in anything that is work-related. As it pertains to work, as it pertains to labor, it's a 6-1 ratio with the Lord. The work week that the Lord established for us is what? 6-1 ratio. 6 days on, 1 day off. I prefer 2 days off, but that's just me. 6 days on, 1 day off. The ratio for a slave, a worker, is what? 6 years on, and then at the beginning of the 7th year, free to go. It's the same for the land even. The Lord gives that 6-1 ratio for working the land. If you're going to work the land, you work the land for 6 years. You sow, you plant 6 years. Then after that 6 years, you give the land a sabbatical year of rest. And so the land then takes that 1 year to replenish the nutrients, to revive itself in order to be able to produce an even better crop, a healthier crop in year 8. So that's the 6-1 ratio that the Lord seems to love to use when it comes to the workforce. Some have even suggested that there can be a case built biblically for the fact that the Lord is going to do the same thing and follow that same principle for all labor on this earth, and that is that for 6 millennia, the Lord is going to let us work, but on the 7th millennia, the Lord is going to come back. Now, I could build a case for that biblically, scripturally, but I wouldn't be dogmatic about it, of course. It's an interesting study, though. It's an interesting study following that pattern, and if it's true, keep this in mind, according to the Jews, we're in year 5,781 of the history of this world. I don't know if you knew this or not, but the Jews didn't flip the calendar at 0 when we did. Now, they'll follow our calendar. They won't say BC before Christ. They'll say BCE before Common Era, because these are Orthodox Jews. These aren't Messianic Jews, right? They don't want to make that admission about Christ. So they won't say BC. They'll say BCE, before Common Era, and they won't say AD, which means the year of our Lord in Latin. They'll say CE, which means Common Era. BCE, before Common Era, CE, Common Era. They'll use those years when they're dealing with the outside world. But internally, they don't go by that flipped calendar. They don't do that. They go by their calendar, the Jewish calendar, which supposedly they had going and tracking and ticking from the beginning of creation. Now, I know it can't be extremely accurate, but if they're even close, they're at year 5,781, which means what? The 6th day, the 6th millennia is almost done, and we're coming to the 7th in their calendar. Just an interesting thought for you to kick through. I thought I'd share it with you. Do with it as you wish. That's about as far as I'd be willing to take it, to be honest, but it is an interesting thought. Verse 3, if he, the slave, comes in by himself, he shall go out by himself. If he comes in married, then his wife shall go out with him. Verse 4, if his master has given him a wife, and she has borne him sons or daughters, the wife and her children shall be her master's, and he shall go out by himself. Now that makes sense to me. I think that's really fair. You take out what you took in, and you leave without what you came without. That makes sense. If you brought it, you take it. If you didn't bring it, then that means it belongs to the master and it stays put. If the master of that home, if you don't like that term, if it offends you, use the word manager or boss. If the boss of that home, the head of that home, determined that while you were there as a slave, you could fall in love and marry one of his other slave girls, then you could do that. You could marry that slave girl. You could even have children, little slave kids to that slave girl. You could have your own little life going there, but then what happens? Your 6-year period is up, and you got a big decision to make. It's time to go, but as you're going to see, big thing here, big difference. When it comes to female slaves, they didn't get to leave after 6 years. Female slaves were permanent slaves of the master. So now we have a problem. That man that married that slave girl and has those beautiful little slave kids, his 6 years are up, and if he goes, he's going to turn to a skeleton waiting for them to be released because they're slaves for life in the master's home. So what do you do in that situation? You can't take them out because the master has a claim to that wife, that slave girl, and the kids that she produces. He made an investment in her. She's a worker for his household. She has a position in his household. He's got money invested. He's got a worker there that he can't lose. There's 2 people with a claim on that slave girl and that family. So what do? Well, believe it or not, the Lord thought of that too. Verse 5, but if the servant plainly says, I love my master. See, is this the kind of Old Testament slavery you're thinking about? It's different than what you're thinking, isn't it? This happened a lot. This happened a whole lot. I can see why. If, for example, Donald Trump said, Arlyn, you can have this wing of my home, I'd say, great. I think I'd pick that over Uniontown And I would be okay with doing his dishes and vacuuming his carpet and sweeping his expensive wooden floor. I'd be all right with that. He's got a nice place. As long as he's a good master, as long as he's a good boss. Many people chose that. They would get in those situations of temporary enslavement, temporary servitude, but they would reach a point where they thought to themselves, okay, my 6 years are up and I'm free to go. I can leave. I'm a free man now. I've served my 6-year commitment, but here's the deal. I don't think I'm ever going to be able to do better in life than I could do if I just stay right here. So were they allowed to do that? Were they allowed to stay with their masters after that 6-year commitment? Well, right here. If the servant plainly says, I love my master, my wife, and my children, I will not go out free. Verse 6. Then his master shall bring him to the judges. He shall also bring him to the door or to the doorpost, and his master shall pierce his ear with an awl, and shall serve him, and he shall serve him forever. So if the servant decides, I like my boss, I like this family, I love this household, I love my slave wife, I love my slave kids, this is a good lot in life. I don't want to be a free man. I want to stay right here. And if he makes that decision, it's a big decision. It's now no longer that, it's not like he's served his 6 years, now he's a free agent and he can sign with another team or stay with that team. No. A big switch takes place right here after the 6-year mark. He now has to make a big decision, because if he chooses to stay with the master after that 6-year stint, it is a permanent position. It is a lifelong commitment. He's never allowed to leave that home at any point in the future. And if he makes that decision, that life is so good there with his master and his little family, that he wants to make that lifelong commitment, if he does that, notice, it is a legal proceeding. It is a big deal. This goes before the judges. They make it official. They make it legal. And what they would do is they would take that, as we just read, they would take that servant, they would bring him over to one of the doorposts of the homes, of the home of that master. And they would put his ear up against the wooden doorpost, and they would drive a spike through the ear. They would pierce his ear, temporarily pinning his ear to the door of the home. The symbolism, the message, the visual there is pretty obvious, right? That's an outward expression. That's a statement of what that servant has chosen willfully to do. He has chosen to be bound to that home for life. That's what the spike in the ear stuck to the doorpost means. Now, it doesn't say it in this passage, but the Bible will tell us in other passages that if that was the decision and his ear was pierced and this became a legal thing, they would then, once they pulled that awl, that spike, out of the ear, they would then put a loop earring in his ear. So a guy walking around town with a loop earring, for us, maybe a little weird. I mean, I guess not so much for some of the more progressives in our country, but, you see a guy with a big old loop earring, to me, it's a little off-putting. But if you saw that back then, here's what that meant. That meant that man was a free man. He chose, after being a free man, to remain with his master for life. He must have a good master. That was the statement that you get just by walking around town with that earring. So, let's see what else do I want to share with you here. Let me speak briefly about the New Testament examples we have from this passage. Believe it or not, as we study through these laws, there are a whole lot of connections that we can make to the New Testament. This one should be fairly obvious. From the New Testament apostles, we see a spiritual application or connection to this Old Testament passage. we see the spiritual lessons behind it. Galatians chapter 5, verse 1. The scripture tells us that it is for freedom that Christ has set us free. He set us free to make us free. He wanted to give us liberty. We were slaves to sin. We were bound to Satan. He set us free just so that we could have that freedom. He tells his disciples in John chapter 15, verse 15, I no longer call you slaves, servants, because the servant doesn't know what the master's doing. He doesn't know the master's business. They're a worker, man. That's it. They're disconnected from the family. But I call you friends because you've entered a different relationship with me. No longer are you servants, just servants to me, but you're friends. And I reveal to you everything that the Father has revealed to me. That's what Jesus tells them there in John chapter 15, verse 15. So you would think that as we learn what the New Testament says about that, about our freedom and about us no longer being slaves but friends to Christ, you would think that means we abandon that word, that we get away from that thing altogether, that we don't think of ourselves as servants or slaves to God or anyone. We're just too good for that, right? Well, but what did the apostles do? Having heard, hey, you're no longer servants, you're friends. What did the apostles do? Romans chapter 1, verse 1. Paul, a bondservant of Jesus Christ. James chapter 1, verse 1. James, a bondservant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ. 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 1. Simon Peter, a bondservant and apostle of Jesus Christ. Jude chapter 1, verse 1. Jude, a bondservant of Jesus Christ. That word bondservant is the Greek word doulos, and that speaks specifically of the servant that had his liberty given to him. He had the green light to go in his freedom, but he chose to stay as a servant in that household. He was now called a bondservant, a doulos. And that is the title that the apostles developed and maintained and used above all other titles that they used in the scriptures. They were servants at one time. Christ, for freedom's sake, set them free. They were free people, but what did they do? Oh, just like Exodus chapter 21, they loved their master so much, who gave them their freedom, that they chose to be not servants against their will, not servants carrying out a term commitment, but they chose to be bond servants of Jesus Christ for life. The master was so good. Life in the master's house was so good. Life at the master's table was so good that above all, they didn't want to leave. So you got a bunch of people, spiritually speaking, in this building tonight that have had their ears spiked to the doorpost of the master's house. We've been given a loop earring, metaphorically. We're bondservants of Christ. We've been granted our freedom, but we choose, because of the goodness of our master, to remain as his servants for life. So I just love that picture and how that connects. Again, I'll just say something I've said to you before. When it comes to slavery, when it comes to being a servant, again, that's the same word. When it comes to being a doulos, a bondservant, what makes that a good thing or a bad thing is the goodness or the cruelty of the one that you're serving. And make no mistake about it, regardless of what the world says, everyone is serving a master. Everyone. We know that in this church because the scriptures tell us. And if you don't believe that, you can read for yourself in Romans chapter 6, verses 16 through 23 tonight, where the Apostle Paul lays it flat out. You were slaves to sin. You were under the bondage of the world and its curse. And now the Lord set you free, and now you're a servant, a slave to righteousness. You got to make a pick. You can be a slave to sin or a slave to righteousness. It will be one or the other, no matter how hard you try to resist that. It just will be one or the other. So I got to tell you, life as a servant in my master's home is pretty good. That's the way I feel about it. I don't know about you. I chose to be a bondservant of Jesus Christ because I couldn't do any better for myself. I couldn't save myself. I couldn't give myself eternal life. My master's good, and I'm happy as a servant. I hope you are as well.